The neighborhood was the kind of place where appearances mattered more than anything else. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, freshly painted fences, every detail was dictated by the HOA. On the surface, it looked like a picture-perfect community, the type you might see on a postcard. But under that polished surface lurked something far less pleasant. Petty disputes, power struggles, neighbors who thought rules were weapons. And at the center of it all stood one woman, Karen. Karen lived 3 houses down from me, and if there was one thing she loved more than gossip, it was reminding everyone that she considered herself the unofficial enforcer of the HOA. She wasn't even on the board, but that never stopped her from marching around the neighborhood with her clipboard, pointing out violations that she thought reflected poorly on the community. She relished writing passive-aggressive notes about trash cans left out too long, weeds in flower beds, or lawns that weren't quite as green as hers. For the most part, I ignored her antics. But everything changed the day she decided to turn her sights on me, or more specifically on my peacock. The peacock had been part of my family for years. He was a striking bird, full of color and personality, and he wandered freely around my backyard. His long tail feathers shimmered with shades of blue, green, and gold, and when the sunlight hit just right, it looked like he was glowing. He wasn't just a pet. He was a living work of art, and most of my neighbors actually admired him. Children would stop during walks just to watch him fan his tail, and even people driving through slowed down to catch a glimpse. But Karen? She hated him. The first time she saw the peacock strutting along the edge of my yard, she rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. To her, the bird wasn't majestic or beautiful. It was a nuisance and a violation of community standards. She started telling anyone who would listen that peacocks were loud, filthy, and disruptive, even though the bird was quiet compared to half the barking dogs in the neighborhood. Her campaign against the peacock escalated quickly. At first, it was offhand comments at HOA meetings, snide remarks about wild animals in civilized neighborhoods. Then came the letters. Handwritten notes shoved in my mailbox, accusing me of breaking rules that didn't even exist. She highlighted passages from the HOA handbook, twisting the language to fit her argument. When that didn't work, she resorted to mockery. Karen began mocking the peacock in front of groups of neighbors, flapping her arms dramatically and making screeching noises whenever he was nearby. She laughed about how ridiculous it was to treat a barnyard bird as a pet. Sometimes she would stop on the sidewalk just to clap loudly, trying to scare him back into the yard. More than once, I caught her pointing her phone at him, recording his every move like she was gathering evidence. I did my best to stay calm. After all, most of the neighbors liked the peacock, and the HOA rules said nothing about exotic pets as long as they were cared for and didn't cause damage. But Karen wasn't interested in rules. She wanted control, and she wanted the bird gone. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in orange streaks, I noticed Karen lingering in front of my driveway. Her arms were crossed, and she was staring at the peacock like he had personally insulted her. The bird, oblivious, strutted proudly across the lawn, his feathers fanned out like a jeweled crown. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to admire him, snapping quick photos. But Karen just sneered. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to blow over. Karen wasn't going to stop until she made my life miserable. And as much as I wanted to believe her obsession would fade, it only seemed to fuel her. She wanted a fight, and soon enough she was going to get one. Over the next few days, her tactics grew even more desperate. She started spreading rumors, whispering to anyone within earshot that my peacock had scratched her car, frightened her grandchildren, and even attacked her while she walked past my house. None of it was true, but she told the stories with such conviction that some people actually began to believe her. The tension in the neighborhood grew thicker with every passing day. Some people avoided taking sides, pretending not to notice the drama. Others tried to keep the peace, suggesting compromises that Karen dismissed outright. And then there were those who secretly enjoyed the spectacle, peeking through blinds whenever Karen launched into one of her tirades. I tried to keep my head down, but it wasn't easy. Each time I walked outside, Karen found a way to make her presence known. Her loud sighs, her exaggerated gestures, her not-so-subtle insults. It was as if she was daring me to react. And though I bit my tongue more times than I could count, I knew it was only a matter of time before things reached a breaking point. That breaking point came sooner than I expected. One warm evening, the peacock wandered a little farther than usual, strolling down the edge of Karen's yard. She was sitting on her porch at the time, and instead of ignoring him, she leapt to her feet in a fury. From where I stood in my driveway, I could see her pointing, shouting, and mocking, her voice carrying down the street. Neighbors stepped out of their homes to see what the commotion was about, and once again, Karen had turned my bird into the center of attention. But this time the peacock didn't retreat. He stood tall, feathers raised, as though he understood he was being ridiculed. His bright eyes locked onto her, and for a brief moment, the whole neighborhood went silent, watching the strange standoff between woman and bird. Karen laughed, tossing her hands into the air as if she had won. But little did she know this battle was far from over, and the peacock wasn't about to remain a passive target for much longer. The stage was set. The neighborhood was divided, and the next move, whether anyone expected it or not, belonged to the peacock. The following morning, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers about the spectacle that had unfolded the night before. Karen had turned the encounter into her personal stage, and by sunrise, her version of events was already spreading like wildfire. According to her, the peacock had charged at her, hissed, and nearly clawed her face. The story grew more exaggerated with every retelling, as if she were describing some monstrous beast instead of a brightly feathered bird. Neighbors who had been there knew the truth. They'd seen the bird simply standing his ground, feathers fanned wide, while Karen flailed around like she was auditioning for a bad comedy act. But Karen didn't care about the facts. She wanted control of the story, and she was determined to frame herself as the victim. By midday, she had already marched to the HOA president's house demanding action. From across the street, I watched her waving her arms, her shrill voice carrying as she insisted that the bird was a danger to the community. The president, a weary man who had dealt with Karen's antics many times before, listened with polite patience. He nodded, he scribbled notes, but his expression revealed the truth. This wasn't the first time he'd been cornered by her, and it wouldn't be the last. Still, the damage was done. Karen's words planted seeds of doubt, and soon people who once admired the peacock began to wonder if maybe he really was a problem. I could feel the shift in the air as conversations turned more cautious, less friendly. The joy my bird once brought to the neighborhood now hung under a shadow of suspicion, all because one woman refused to let him exist in peace. But Karen wasn't satisfied with whispers and accusations. She wanted proof, or at least something she could pass off as proof. And so she began her campaign of surveillance. For days, she lingered near the edge of my property with her phone raised, recording every step the peacock took. If he wandered onto the sidewalk, she gasped loudly. If he strutted near her yard, she snapped dozens of photos, as if documenting a crime scene. Neighbors began avoiding her, embarrassed by her theatrics, but she didn't care. In her mind, she was building a case, brick by brick. I knew what she was doing, but there wasn't much I could say. The HOA rules didn't forbid taking photos in public spaces, and Karen was clever enough to frame her obsession as concern. Still, I could see the cracks forming in her composure. Her voice carried a little sharper each time she spoke about the bird. Her body language grew more hostile, her patience thinner. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was personal. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. The sun was high, the heat pressing down like a heavy blanket. I had just returned home when I saw Karen standing by her car, phone in hand, muttering to herself. The peacock, curious as ever, wandered down the street, his feathers catching the light in dazzling flashes. He paused near Karen's driveway, tilting his head as if studying her. Karen froze, then began mocking him again, flapping her arms wildly and squawking in a way that turned heads up and down the street. A few neighbors peeked out from their porches, some shaking their heads, others chuckling quietly. To them, it was another ridiculous performance. To Karen, it was an opportunity to prove the bird was a menace. But the peacock wasn't intimidated. He stepped closer, his tail spreading like a jeweled fan, shimmering under the sun. His movements were deliberate, almost regal, as though he were announcing that this was his territory. Karen's laughter grew louder, shriller, echoing through the neighborhood. She pointed at him, her voice rising in mockery. And then, in one swift, startling motion, the peacock leapt forward. His wings spread wide, and with surprising force, he landed squarely on the hood of Karen's car. The sound was immediate, the sharp crack of claws meeting metal, the thud of his weight settling onto the surface. Karen screamed, dropping her phone, her face twisting in shock and outrage. Neighbors gasped as the bird strutted across the hood, tail feathers brushing against the windshield. Karen shouted, waving her arms wildly, but the peacock was unfazed. He tapped his beak against the glass, peering inside as though inspecting the vehicle. And then, with one powerful strike of his talon, the windshield splintered. The sharp crack echoed through the street, silencing everyone who had gathered to watch. The glass webbed outward from the point of impact, a jagged starburst that grew wider with each strike. Karen screamed louder, her voice breaking as she rushed toward the car, flailing helplessly at the bird. But the peacock stood his ground, pecking again and again until the windshield bore a gaping crack across its surface. The neighborhood erupted in chaos. Some people tried to pull Karen back, afraid she might hurt herself in her panic. Others fumbled for their phones, recording the entire scene. And in the middle of it all, the peacock stood tall, feathers blazing in the sunlight as if declaring victory over his tormentor. Karen's face turned red with fury. She pointed at me across the street, shrieking accusations, her voice hoarse with rage. To her, this wasn't just an accident or a freak incident. This was proof of everything she had claimed, the final piece of evidence she thought she needed to turn the neighborhood against me. But as I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, I saw something Karen didn't. I saw amusement, disbelief, even admiration. The very people she had tried to convince were now whispering to one another, stifling laughter at the absurdity of it all. The bird she called a menace had just humbled her in front of everyone. Karen didn't see it that way, of course. Her shrieks grew louder as she vowed revenge, threatening lawsuits, HOA fines, and animal control. She demanded that someone do something immediately about the peacock, as though the entire neighborhood was obliged to share in her outrage. But no one moved. No one offered to back her up. For the first time, Karen stood alone in her fury, and though the cracked windshield glared back as undeniable damage, the tide of sympathy she had hoped to stir was nowhere to be found. The peacock, his feathers still raised in triumph, finally leapt down from the car and strutted calmly back toward my yard. The street was quiet again, save for Karen's ragged breathing and the faint murmur of neighbors struggling not to laugh. The battle wasn't over. If anything, this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to retreat quietly, not after a humiliation like that. And as much as the neighborhood secretly enjoyed seeing her taken down a peg, I knew she was already plotting her next move. And this time she wasn't going to settle for mocking words or petty complaints. She was going to escalate. The incident with the windshield became the talk of the entire neighborhood. Within hours, the videos captured by amused neighbors began circulating in group chats and on social media. Some clips were grainy and shaky, others caught the moment perfectly. The peacock perched proudly on Karen's hood, the glass spiderwebbing under his talons. Karen screaming in the background like a scene out of a comedy sketch. By the end of the day, the clip had spread far beyond our street. Friends of neighbors were sharing it. People were leaving laughing emojis and captions like, "Don't mess with the peacock" and "Neighborhood hero." For once, the story wasn't under Karen's control. No matter how much she insisted she was the victim, the world saw something different. A woman who had been publicly mocked by a bird she had mocked first. Karen, however, didn't find it funny. The morning after, she stormed into the HOA office before it even opened, pounding on the glass door until someone let her in. By noon, she was marching through the neighborhood with fresh papers in hand, waving them like a weapon. She claimed she had convinced the HOA board to review a special motion to address the exotic animal threat. The flyers she passed out were filled with bold underlined words: safety hazard, dangerous wildlife, property damage. She even included blurry still shots from the video, cropped to make the peacock look menacing. Every detail was twisted in her favor. The cracked windshield became an unprovoked attack. Her mocking gestures conveniently were never mentioned. Most neighbors rolled their eyes, tossing the flyers into recycling bins before even finishing the first paragraph. A few people, though, hesitated. They weren't siding with Karen exactly, but they were unsettled by the idea of property damage and liability. What if the bird decided to leap on someone else's car? What if next time it wasn't glass but a person? Karen seized on those doubts, fueling them with dramatic retellings. She began holding impromptu meetings on her front lawn, gesturing wildly as she repeated the same lines. The bird was aggressive, the neighborhood wasn't safe, the HOA had an obligation to act. Each time she told the story, the peacock grew larger, meaner, more dangerous in her version. I watched it all unfold from a distance, knowing better than to step into her theater. Arguing would only give her more fuel. And besides, most people saw through her performance. They'd lived next to Karen long enough to recognize her pattern, exaggerate, stir up chaos, demand control. But Karen wasn't just blustering this time. She was organizing. A week after the windshield incident, the HOA announced an emergency meeting. The notice predictably had Karen's fingerprints all over it. The agenda listed discussion of exotic pet policies in bold. She wanted new rules, rules that would give her exactly what she wanted. The power to declare my peacock unwelcome. The meeting drew the largest turnout the HOA had seen in years. Neighbors packed into the small community center, some curious, some annoyed, others secretly excited to watch the drama unfold. Karen arrived early, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a self-satisfied smirk. She had folders of evidence tucked under her arm, photos, statements, exaggerated accounts of her so-called trauma. When the meeting began, she launched into her speech before the chair even finished introductions. She painted herself as a brave resident who had suffered for months in silence, enduring harassment and damage from a wild, uncontrolled animal. She pointed to the cracked windshield as her shining example, her voice trembling as though she were describing a personal tragedy rather than a broken pane of glass. The room was tense, but not in the way Karen imagined. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some trying to hide their smirks. A few raised eyebrows when Karen teared up dramatically, dabbing at her eyes as if she were reliving a trauma. When it was my turn to respond, I spoke simply. I explained that the peacock was a registered pet, well cared for and not against any HOA rule. I reminded them that he had never harmed anyone and that Karen's windshield incident had only occurred after weeks of her harassment and mocking behavior. I didn't have to embellish. The videos already spoke louder than words. And indeed, when the clips were brought up during the meeting, Karen's narrative crumbled. Laughter rippled through the room as people watched her flap her arms like a deranged bird, screeching at the peacock before he finally leapt onto her car. The more she tried to spin it as an attack, the less convincing she sounded. Still, Karen refused to back down. She argued, shouted, and even threatened legal action. Her face grew red, her voice cracked, but she pressed on, insisting that she would not live another day in fear of that monster bird. In the end, the board delayed the decision. They promised to review the rules and consult outside resources, a move meant to calm Karen without committing to her demands. The meeting ended in a storm of mutters and sighs, with neighbors filing out more entertained than concerned. But Karen left fuming, her eyes blazing with the kind of determination that spelled trouble. She had been humiliated twice now, once by the bird and once by her own neighbors laughing at her performance. Humiliation was something Karen could never swallow. And so she shifted her strategy. If the HOA wouldn't remove the peacock, she would take matters into her own hands. Over the next week, strange things began happening around my property. Food scraps appeared near the sidewalk as if someone were trying to lure the peacock away. Loud banging noises erupted at night, startling the bird and sending him fluttering in distress. Once I even caught the faint smell of vinegar near the fence line. A crude attempt to drive him off. It didn't take a detective to figure out who was behind it. Karen had moved from public humiliation to private sabotage, and though she thought she was being clever, her desperation was obvious. But the thing about desperation is that it often backfires, and Karen's efforts to drive out the peacock were about to set the stage for her greatest humiliation yet, one that would make the shattered windshield look like a minor inconvenience. Because while Karen was busy plotting in the shadows, the neighborhood's patience with her was running out. People were growing tired of her antics, her drama, her endless attempts to control everyone else's lives. And soon, it wouldn't just be the peacock standing in her way. Karen's quiet sabotage didn't stay quiet for long. The scraps of food, the banging in the night, the odd smells near my fence, these weren't things only I noticed. Neighbors walking their dogs began spotting her lingering by my yard late at night. Someone even caught her scattering breadcrumbs on the sidewalk, pretending she was feeding the birds. The truth was becoming harder for her to hide, and the neighborhood's tolerance for her theatrics was wearing thin. Yet Karen's obsession only grew. The more the community rolled their eyes at her, the more determined she became to make her campaign against my peacock succeed. She wanted control and she wanted revenge. Her breaking point came on a warm Saturday morning. The neighborhood was buzzing with weekend activity. Kids riding bikes, sprinklers spraying over green lawns, and families working in their gardens. I was in my backyard, tidying up, when I heard Karen's voice again. It was sharp, angry, carrying down the street like a siren. She was in her driveway, once again holding court in front of anyone who would listen. This time she wasn't just complaining, she was threatening. She shouted about lawsuits, animal control, and even hinted at taking care of the problem herself. She waved a stack of papers that she claimed were legal documents, though they looked suspiciously like printed pages from the internet. The peacock, drawn by the commotion, wandered toward her yard. His feathers shimmered in the sun, tail fanned in a dazzling display as though he knew he was the star of the show. Neighbors paused, watching curiously as the familiar standoff began again. Karen shouting, the peacock strutting, the air thick with tension. But this time the scene didn't stop at words. In a fit of rage, Karen grabbed her garden hose, turned the nozzle to full blast, and aimed directly at the bird. A jet of water shot across the yard, startling him. He stumbled back at first, shaking droplets from his feathers. But instead of fleeing, he grew taller, wings spreading wide, tail feathers fully raised. His cry pierced the air, sharp and commanding, and for a moment the entire street went silent. Then, in one swift motion, the peacock launched himself forward. He flew straight toward Karen's car, the same one he had cracked before, and landed hard on the hood. His claws scraped down the paint with a screeching sound that made everyone wince. Karen shrieked, fumbling with the hose, spraying water wildly across the driveway. The bird stomped across the hood with deliberate steps, his talons clicking against the metal. He tilted his head, looked directly at Karen, then turned his attention to the windshield once more. With one powerful strike, his beak hammered against the glass. The sound cracked through the street, and just like before, a web of fractures spread outward. Only this time, the damage was far worse. Within seconds, the windshield collapsed inward, shards scattering across the dashboard in a glittering mess. Gasps and laughter erupted from the neighbors watching. Some pulled out their phones to record. Others covered their mouths in shock. Karen's face was a mix of fury and horror as she dropped the hose, clutching her hair with both hands. She screamed, stomped her feet, and pointed at the bird, her voice breaking as she accused him of attacking again. But the neighborhood didn't buy her performance anymore. They had seen too much. They had seen her provoke, harass, and mock, and now they were witnessing the consequence of her own actions. The more she shouted, the less anyone cared. The HOA president, who happened to be walking by at that moment, shook his head in disbelief. He told Karen bluntly that this had gone far enough. Her antics had turned the community upside down, and her vendetta against the peacock had made her a spectacle. Instead of siding with her, he announced that the board would be drafting a new code of conduct, not for exotic pets, but for residents who engaged in harassment and disruptive behavior. It was the final blow to Karen's crusade. The very authority she had tried to manipulate had turned against her. Karen's humiliation was complete. Her broken windshield glared at her, the shards of glass reflecting the sunlight like a cruel mirror. Neighbors snickered behind their hands. Children whispered excitedly about the peacock who fought back, and the videos of the bird's triumph were already spreading online once again. As for the peacock, he strutted off the hood with regal calm, feathers trailing behind him like a victory banner. He returned to my yard, unbothered by the chaos he had left behind. To him, it was just another day, but to the neighborhood, it was the moment Karen's reign of pettiness finally ended. From that day forward, the street felt different. Karen still lived there, of course, but she kept to herself, her loud voice no longer echoing down the block. The clipboard disappeared. The passive-aggressive notes stopped. Her power, once fueled by fear and compliance, had evaporated under the weight of her own downfall. And the peacock? He became something of a legend. Neighbors greeted him warmly, children pointed in delight when he spread his feathers, and visitors asked about the famous bird. He had gone from a target of ridicule to the symbol of our neighborhood's resilience against unnecessary drama. In the end, Karen's windshield wasn't the only thing shattered. Her grip on the community, her image as the self-appointed enforcer, and her endless crusade for control all lay in pieces, just like the glass she tried so desperately to defend. And every time the peacock fanned his tail and strutted proudly through the street, it was a reminder to everyone who lived there. Sometimes justice comes with feathers.